It's around 6:44 a.m. local time on December 4th in New York City. Local authorities receive a call. Gunshots fired outside the Hilton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan.
Got a male shot outside of the hotel. No perp description at this time.
The CEO of one of the biggest health insurers in the country was just gunned down in the middle of Manhattan in what would later be identified as a targeted hit. A manhunt is underway for the gunman who is at large, but here's what we know so far about the suspect's movement before and after the killing.
Before sunrise, in one of the busiest parts of Manhattan, a man in a mask stood waiting. He was not running, he was not pacing, he was not moving like someone making a last-second decision. He looked like someone who had already decided exactly how this morning would end. Around him, New York was waking up like it always does. Hotel staff were starting their shifts. Business travelers were heading out. Executives were preparing for a major investor event. Nothing about the street suggested that, within seconds, it would become one of the most talked-about crime scenes in America. Then Brian Thompson appeared. At 6:44 a.m. on December 4th, 2024, the CEO of UnitedHealthcare walked toward the New York Hilton Midtown, where his company was holding an investors' meeting. According to investigators, the masked man had been waiting for him. Moments later, shots rang out. Thompson collapsed. The gunman fled. But this case did not shock the country only because a major CEO had been killed in public. It exploded because of what investigators say was left behind. Shell casings marked with the words delay, deny, and depose. Words that seemed to point far beyond one victim and toward something larger. A message, a grievance, a symbol. 5 days later, police arrested 26-year-old Luigi Mangione in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Authorities say he was carrying a weapon consistent with the one used in the attack, false IDs, and a handwritten text criticizing the American healthcare system. Mangione has pleaded not guilty, and from that moment on, this case became more than a murder investigation. It became a national argument about power, about healthcare, about anger, about whether this was simply a targeted killing or the violent expression of a much deeper public resentment that had been building for years. Because Brian Thompson was not just any victim, he led one of the largest health insurers in America, in an industry millions of people associate with denied claims, delayed care, and crushing bureaucracy. And the man accused of killing him, according to prosecutors, may have seen him not just as a person, but as a symbol. That is what makes this case so unsettling. A CEO gunned down before dawn, a suspect found days later with writings and false IDs, a country reacting with both horror and rage, and a legal case that, even now, is still unfolding. To understand how this happened, you have to go back before the shooting, to the days when the accused, if investigators are right, was already moving through New York and preparing for something deadly. If investigators are right, then the real beginning of this case was not the moment Brian Thompson was shot. It began 10 days earlier, when a man arrived in New York City and, according to authorities, started moving with quiet purpose. On November 24, 2024, the suspect arrived at the Port Authority bus terminal on a Greyhound bus that had originated in Atlanta. Investigators later said they could not determine exactly where he boarded along the route. That uncertainty mattered. From the start, whoever carried out this attack seemed to be minimizing traces of himself. That same day, the suspect checked into the New York City hostel on Manhattan's Upper West Side using a false New Jersey ID and paying in cash. Or both choices fit the pattern prosecutors would later describe: deliberate, careful, and designed to reduce visibility. Then came the moment that would become one of the first major breaks in the case. During check-in, the suspect briefly lowered his mask. That small moment, caught on surveillance video, gave investigators one of the clearest images they had. Later, when those photos were released, the public latched onto them almost immediately. In a case filled with blurred footage and covered faces, this image felt different. It made the mystery suddenly more personal. There was a face now, a real person, somewhere behind the planning, the movement, and the violence that had not yet happened. According to investigators, he did not come to New York for a quick visit. He stayed for about 10 days. Authorities believe he cased the New York Hilton Midtown on the same day he arrived. If that is true, it suggests this was never spontaneous. It suggests surveillance, observation, waiting. That is one of the most chilling parts of this case. While tourists checked into hotels, while office workers rushed through Midtown, while holiday traffic built across the city, investigators say someone may already have been studying the location of a future assassination. Not a burst of anger, not a random encounter, a setup, a target area, a routine to learn. The suspect stayed in the hostel for most of the 10 days, leaving briefly and then checking back in. Even small gaps in that timeline started to matter, because once investigators began to view the shooting as planned, every movement took on more weight. Every checkout, every return, every camera sighting, every hour not fully explained. At the center of all this was Brian Thompson. Thompson was not just another executive traveling for work. He was the CEO of UnitedHealthcare, the insurance arm of United Health Group, one of the largest and most influential healthcare companies in the United States. Under his leadership, UnitedHealthcare remained enormously profitable. But it also operated inside one of the most bitterly criticized systems in American life. For some people, Thompson represented business success, leadership, and corporate achievement. For others, he represented something much darker, an industry associated with denials, delays, prior authorizations, and the feeling that care could be blocked by bureaucracy and profit. That public anger did not start with his death. It was already there. And long before the shooting, major insurers, including UnitedHealthcare, had faced criticism over claims practices and access to care. According to Thompson's widow, he had even received threats tied to insurance coverage issues. None of that explains murder. But it helps explain why this case ignited such intense emotions so quickly. Because if prosecutors are right, they believe the accused was not just targeting a man. They believe he was targeting what that man represented. A symbolic target is different from a personal enemy. A symbolic target is chosen for visibility, for meaning, for the message the act is supposed to send. And if that is what happened here, then almost every detail of the location begins to make more sense. The time of day, the hotel, the investor conference, the crowded corporate setting. And this was not just where Thompson happened to be, it may have been part of why he was chosen. Then came the morning of December 4th. According to investigators, the suspect left the hostel at 5:34 a.m. and rode an e-bike toward Midtown. At 6:17 a.m., he was seen buying coffee, water, and granola bars at a Starbucks near the Hilton. A few minutes later, surveillance showed him walking while talking on the phone. Whether he was truly speaking to someone or merely trying to appear casual has remained one of those small but haunting details. By 6:39 a.m., investigators say he was waiting outside the Hilton. Waiting. Not lost, not wandering. Waiting. At 6:40 a.m., Brian Thompson left the nearby Marriott where he had stayed and walked toward the Hilton. 4 minutes later, he approached the sidewalk outside the hotel entrance. Then the shooting began. Authorities say the gunman stepped forward and fired multiple times with a suppressed 9mm pistol, striking Thompson in the back and leg. Surveillance suggested the weapon jammed or malfunctioned, and the shooter appeared to rack it before continuing. That detail stayed with investigators and the public alike. It suggested composure. It suggested the kind of focus that does not collapse under pressure. The whole attack lasted only seconds. Then the shooter ran. Investigators say he fled northbound, escaped on an e-bike into Central Park, and later discarded a backpack. Inside that backpack, police said they found items including a jacket and Monopoly money. The symbolism, if it was symbolism, only deepened the mystery. Later, authorities said the shell casings at the scene had been marked with the words delay, deny, and depose. Suddenly, this was no longer just a targeted shooting. It looked like a message. The question was, a message to whom? By 7:12 a.m., Brian Thompson was pronounced dead at Mount Sinai West. The CEO of one of the most powerful insurance companies in America had been killed on a Manhattan sidewalk before sunrise. And within hours, the investigation had become national news. Police released descriptions of the suspect. A white male, around 6'1", wearing a light-colored hooded jacket, dark pants, and black sneakers with white soles. Investigators described him as camera-aware, which seemed obvious from the footage. He moved like someone who understood surveillance, understood concealment, and had thought carefully about how he would be seen. Still, he had left pieces behind: a water bottle, a phone, a candy wrapper, a backpack, surveillance images. A trail through one of the most monitored cities in the world. The city itself had become evidence, and now investigators were trying to answer the question that would define the case. Who was the man in the footage, and how much had he planned? The answer, they believed, was already hundreds of miles away. And in 5 days, inside a McDonald's in Pennsylvania, this case would take its most dramatic turn. If this story is pulling you in, stay with it. Because the next part is where the masked figure in surveillance footage becomes a named defendant, and the case shifts from a manhunt into a national firestorm. And tell me this in the comments. From everything you've heard so far, does this feel more like a carefully staged message or a targeted killing that only later took on symbolism? The break in the case did not come from a dramatic chase through city streets. It came inside a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. 5 days after Brian Thompson was killed, on December 9, 2024, the search took a sudden turn. By then, the suspect's images had spread everywhere. Surveillance stills from New York were on television, online, and across social media. A customer inside the McDonald's thought he recognized a man sitting there and alerted an employee who contacted police. That moment changed everything. Until then, the suspect had felt almost ghost-like, a masked figure moving through surveillance footage, leaving evidence behind but remaining unnamed. Now, according to authorities, they had him in public, seated, visible, and within reach. The man they arrested was 26-year-old Luigi Mangione, and what investigators say they found on him immediately pushed the case into a much more explosive phase. Authorities alleged that Mangione was carrying a 3D printed pistol and a 3D printed suppressor consistent with the weapon used in the shooting. They said he had multiple false IDs, including one tied to the same name used at the Manhattan hostel. They also said he had a handwritten document criticizing the American healthcare system. That was the moment the story changed from a hunt for a shooter into a broader argument about motive, ideology, and public anger. Because now the case had a face, a name, and, according to investigators, possible writings that seemed to explain why the attack may have happened. Police said the handwritten text addressed to the feds spoke to Mangione's motivation and mindset. Authorities and media reports quickly focused on its anti-healthcare industry language. Prosecutors would later argue that the note, along with other alleged writings and materials, showed a deep hostility toward the health insurance system and reflected planning, grievance, and justification. If prosecutors prove that, then Brian Thompson may not have been targeted because of a personal dispute at all. He may have been targeted because he stood at the top of a system the accused allegedly viewed as predatory. That distinction matters. A personal murder tells one story, a symbolic assassination tells another. And once the public began to see this killing through that second lens, the case exploded far beyond the courtroom. Mangione was first charged in Pennsylvania with offenses including carrying a gun without a license, forgery, false identification, and possessing instruments of crime. By the end of the same day, he had also been charged in Manhattan in connection with Thompson's killing. The legal process was now moving on multiple tracks at once. He was arraigned in Altoona and pleaded not guilty. Bail was denied. Extradition proceedings followed. Meanwhile, New York prosecutors escalated the case. On December 17th, they added first-degree murder as an act of terrorism. That was a major move, because when prosecutors use terrorism language, they are saying this was not just a murder. They are saying it was violence meant to send a broader message, to intimidate, or to strike beyond the immediate victim. And at that point, many people could see why they went there. The victim was high profile. The setting was public and symbolic. The shell casings carried loaded words. The writings allegedly pointed to ideology. The public reaction suggested the act had touched something much larger than one crime. But strong charges are not always lasting charges. That would become important later. For now, the prosecution's case seemed formidable. They had the arrest. They had the alleged weapon. They had the false IDs. They had the alleged writings. They had surveillance images and timeline evidence. They also said fingerprints connected Mangione to the area around the crime. To many watching from the outside, it looked overwhelming. But criminal cases are not decided by first impressions. They are decided by what survives legal scrutiny. That is where Mangione's defense became critical. He hired Karen Friedman Agnifilo, a former Manhattan prosecutor with deep familiarity with the system, now prosecuting him. That signaled immediately that this was not going to be a passive defense. Every part of the case would be tested. Every search, every seizure, every forensic link, every statement, every alleged connection between ideology and action. And outside the courtroom, something else was happening. The reaction online was unlike almost anything seen in a major murder case. There was sympathy for Brian Thompson, of course. Public officials condemned the killing. His family mourned a husband and father. But alongside that grief came something else: rage at the healthcare industry. For many Americans, this case instantly became about more than one victim. It tapped into years of resentment over denied claims, delayed care, prior authorizations, impossible bills, and the feeling that survival itself can be blocked by institutions built around cost and bureaucracy. Some people used the case to condemn the healthcare system while still rejecting violence. Others went further, reacting with mockery toward Thompson or open admiration for the accused. That was one of the most disturbing parts of this story. Not only that a CEO had been killed, but that the reaction revealed how deep the public bitterness already was. This did not mean violence was widely accepted, but it did mean the killing landed on an open wound. That public reaction also changed the atmosphere around the legal case. Suddenly, this was not just the trial of a murder defendant. It was a cultural battleground. Mangione quickly became a projection screen for all kinds of anger, ideology, and frustration. Thompson, meanwhile, risked being flattened into a symbol rather than remembered as a person whose life had been violently ended. That moral tension has never left the case, because two truths existed at once. Brian Thompson was a real man with a family, not just a symbol of corporate power. And public fury at the healthcare system was real, widespread, and deeply personal for millions of Americans. The case forced both truths into the same frame. Mangione waived extradition and appeared in federal court in New York on December 19, 2024. Days later, on December 23rd, he was arraigned in New York State Court and pleaded not guilty to all charges. By then, prosecutors had built a huge case on paper. State murder charges, weapons offenses, forgery counts, federal stalking-related charges, and the possibility of the death penalty in the federal case. But even at that stage, the real battle had not begun. Because what looks airtight in headlines can become much more fragile inside a courtroom. The closer the case moved to trial, the more important the real questions became. Was every search lawful? Would every piece of seized evidence be admitted? Could prosecutors cleanly connect the alleged weapon to the shooting? How strongly could they link the writings to motive without overreaching? And most importantly, how much of the dramatic public narrative would actually survive under the rules of law? That is where the case was heading next. Because in the months ahead, some of the most explosive parts of the prosecution's framing would begin to narrow, and the story the public thought it understood would become far more contested than it first appeared. If you're still here, stay with me, because the next part is where this story becomes even more revealing. Not just about the murder, but about what can actually be proved when a case this symbolic enters the cold machinery of the legal system. And tell me in the comments, do you think the public reaction in a case like this helps reveal the truth, or makes it harder to see clearly? By the time the case moved deeper into 2025, public opinion had already hardened. To many people, the story seemed simple. Brian Thompson had been targeted and killed. Luigi Mangione had been arrested with evidence linking him to the crime, and the rest was just procedure. But in court, just procedure is often where everything changes. Because once the headlines cool and the outrage settles, a criminal case is forced into a different world. A slower world. A world where symbolism is not enough, where emotion is not evidence, and where prosecutors must turn a powerful public narrative into charges that can survive the strict demands of the law. That is exactly what happened here. The government's early theory was sweeping. It framed the killing not only as murder, but as something larger, a deliberate symbolic act shaped by planning, grievance, and message-driven violence. On an emotional level, many people understood that framing, the shell casings, the writings, the victim's public role, and the national reaction. It all seemed to support the idea that this was meant to resonate far beyond the sidewalk where it happened. But law does not operate on resonance, and over time, the courts began narrowing the case. In September 2025, a judge dismissed the terrorism-related murder charges in the New York State case. That ruling did not erase the seriousness of the killing. It did not mean Mangione was cleared, and it did not destroy the prosecution's entire case. But it did force an important correction. It showed that the most dramatic public framing of a crime is not always the same as what the law can sustain. That distinction became even sharper in January 2026, when a federal judge dismissed two major federal charges and ruled that prosecutors could not seek the death penalty against Mangione under the theory they had advanced. Again, the case remained serious. Mangione still faced major charges, but once more, the courts narrowed the government's original framing. And that is where this story becomes bigger than one murder prosecution, because it shows how modern criminal cases unfold under enormous pressure from media, politics, public anger, and internet mythology. The public sees a dramatic storyline and often assumes the legal outcome is inevitable. The courtroom does something very different. It asks, what can actually be proved? That question is still at the center of this case. Authorities have alleged that Mangione had a weapon and suppressor consistent with those used in the attack. They have pointed to false IDs, surveillance footage, fingerprint claims, timeline evidence, and writings that prosecutors say reveal motive and planning. Each piece may sound powerful, but each piece also has to survive challenge. Was the arrest handled lawfully? Was the search valid? Can the chain of custody for every item be clearly shown? Can prosecutors prove the weapon's connection to the shooting to the standard the law requires? Can they authenticate the writings and connect them to intent without inflaming the jury unfairly? Can they argue motive without turning the trial into a sweeping political battle over American healthcare? These are not minor questions. They are the entire case. And meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the symbolic life of the case kept growing. Polls and public reaction suggested something many leaders found deeply uncomfortable. While most Americans condemned the killing, many also believed the conduct of the health insurance industry helped create the anger surrounding it. Among younger Americans especially, reactions were more divided than many expected. That does not mean the killing was widely supported. It means the case exposed something already boiling under the surface. For years, millions of people have described healthcare in America not as care, but as struggle. Denials, delays, appeals, bills, waiting, fear. The exhausting sense that access to treatment can depend on institutions built to limit cost rather than relieve suffering. That anger did not start on December 4, 2024. More, the killing simply forced it into full view. And that is why this case became so morally disorienting. Because it held two realities at once. One, Brian Thompson was murdered. He was not an abstract role. He was a husband, a father, and a real human being whose life ended in seconds. Two, the public fury unleashed by the case came from real lived experiences with a system many people believe has harmed them. Both are true. Ignoring either one makes the story easier but less honest. That may be why this case will continue to matter even after the trial ends. Because the verdict, whatever it is, will settle only some of the questions. It may answer criminal responsibility. It will not answer the deeper social question the case exposed. What happens when millions of people lose faith in the systems meant to protect them? That is the haunting shadow behind everything here. Not just the image of a masked shooter waiting in the cold. Not just the arrest in Altoona. Not just the writings, the shell casings, or the legal rulings. But the realization that this murder became a mirror reflecting grief, a mirror reflecting rage, a mirror reflecting a country where trust in major institutions has eroded so deeply that a single act of violence could instantly become part crime story, part political argument, part warning sign. And that may be the final reason this case lingers so powerfully. because it is not only about a CEO who was killed or a suspect who was charged. It is about the conditions that made the killing feel to many people like more than an isolated crime. It felt like a signal, a rupture, a moment when private pain, corporate power, and public resentment collided in a way the country could not ignore. The courts will decide what can be proved about Luigi Mangione. But the wider tension this case exposed is not going away. That part will outlast the trial. And maybe that is the hardest truth in all of this. The murder shocked the country. The reaction revealed it was already on edge. If this gave you a deeper view of the case, subscribe and stay with the channel for more careful, evidence-based true crime storytelling. And tell me in the comments, when this case is remembered years from now, do you think people will focus more on the killing itself or on what the reaction revealed about healthcare, power, and anger in America?